Hi, my name's Ned Cooper. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands I'm recording this video and pay respects to elders past and present. Today I'm presenting my exploratory paper entitled Would the Trees Dim the Lights? Adopting the Intentional Stance for More Than Human Participatory Design. As many attendees at this conference will know, design has been dominated by a human-centered paradigm for almost 4 decades now. Recently, however, scholars of more than human design have been experimenting with design processes to try and shift design mindsets. Several contributors to this conference, for example, have pushed the design community to try and transcend the limited focus of human-centered design on human entities and consider a broader set of relations. To date, there have been experiments situating designers in the environment in which a technological artifact will operate, and experiments encouraging designers to embody non-human entities in those environments, to kind of consider the experiences of other species or things. However, as Yoko Okama and others noted at the 2020 Participatory Design Conference, participation implies the equivalent of human voice, rights, representation and structures of decision-making. So while situated or embodied experiences may enable designers to kind of see other worlds more clearly, there's a need to design processes that legitimate the perspectives of non-human entities through participatory design. My paper explores how adopting the intentional stance, which is a concept from philosophy, could enable the participation of entities from the biophysical and ecological worlds in addition to the human world. So a brief overview of the intentional stance. Daniel Dennett described the intentional stance in his book of the same name. In essence, Dennett argues that when we predict or explain the behavior of another entity, which could be a human, an animal, an artifact, really any object or system, we view that entity at varying levels of abstraction. In the first level, we predict the behavior of an object or system based on its physical structure. We may abstract from the physical stance to the design stance, predicting the behavior of a system based on our experience or knowledge of how the system is designed. And then finally, the most abstract of all the stances is the intentional stance, which requires no knowledge of either the physical structure or the design. We predict the behavior of another system from our own explanations or interpretations of the beliefs and desires of the other system. In the paper, I argue that adopting the intentional stance might be a useful way to predict the behavior of an entity if it were to participate in design activities by treating that entity as if it had mental states. We might use the intentional stance as a strategy to interpret the behavior of an entity as if it were a rational agent that govern its choice by considering its beliefs, desires, or intentions, which are its mental states. But there's a question as to the conditions under which an entity from either the biophysical or ecological world could be considered to have a mental state that's discernible to human designers. In 2020, I worked with a local council in Australia as part of a team of researchers from the ANU to review the plans and progress of a smart city project. Our report recommended the council adopt a more than human design framework, responding in part to the destruction caused by the 2019 and 2020 Black Summer bushfires here in Australia, which had affected Queanbeyan, which is the region in which the smart city was located. However, we were unable to provide clear processes for the council to enact that framework, that more than human design framework. This led me to search for theories or heuristics that might translate into design processes and eventually to the intentional stance. In the paper, I experiment with adopting the intentional stance in the context of smart lighting systems. Many smart cities include smart lighting systems, including in Queanbeyan, as shown on this slide. And those street lights shine brighter when pedestrians are in the vicinity of the lighting system. So human and non-human entities must coexist with artificial light at night in Queanbeyan in variable intensities. Please check out the paper for my attempts to discern what the mental states of trees and particles of air might be. drawing on secondary ecological research and how I sort of try to interpret the behavior of trees and particles of air based on those mental states. I won't go into detail about those experiments in this presentation, but ultimately, in the case of the trees, I argue that a designer adopting the intentional stance would predict that a tree ought to seek out light within a certain spectrum in natural cycles to optimize photosynthesis. And so, by extension, trees located within an area proposed for a smart lighting system, participating in the design of the smart city, would advocate for minimal disruption to lighting within those parameters. With this information, the Council could then consider the perspective of trees alongside the perspectives of human stakeholders in the smart city. For example, residents of Queanbeyan may desire that the pavement in a certain area is illuminated alongside tree cover to improve accessibility and promote safety. But following the process enabled by adopting the intentional stance, designers may then consider tensions between the interests of human stakeholders and those of trees. In the paper, I also draw attention to 4 key limitations of adopting the intentional stance. Firstly, non-human entities may not act within the rational dynamic assumed by the intentional stance. Second, the intentional stance is focused on predicting the behavior of an individual agent or aggregates of individual agents, but not collectives of agents. We might adopt the intentional stance to predict the behavior of a tree, but what about a forest? And then third, adopting the intentional stance for more than human participatory design assumes that humans can and should speak for non-human entities. And then finally, the case study adopts the intentional stance to interpret the perspectives of entities within the immediate vicinity of a smart lighting system, but how might we expand the boundary of analysis to consider other entities, such as those affected by the supply chain for the lighting system? Alternatives to the intentional stance are also discussed further in the paper, including direct sensing from the environment and engaging more with Indigenous epistemologies to inform design practice. I want to end by noting that the shift to more than human design is urgent. The biophysical and ecological worlds that sustain us both physically and spiritually are rapidly transforming due, at least in part, to our insensitivities to the interdependencies of life on Earth. To translate new design philosophies from the realms of academic research contexts into the everyday practice of design, we need to develop clear processes to enact more than human design. In the paper and in this presentation, I've tried to show how the intentional stance could become such a strategy, a kind of heuristic for designers to enable the participation of non-human entities in design. I encourage application and critique of the intentional stance, considering the limitations raised in the paper. Without developing such heuristics for everyday design, visions of more than human design for smart cities proffered by our research community risk being sidelined in the practice of technology design. Thank you very much.